A very warm welcome to this special broadcast brought to you in partnership with the One Campaign as we commemorate this year's Africa Day. I'm Kenneth. Igbomor. For the next 1 hour, we'll explore ways to protect Africa's progress during the COVID-19 pandemic. But let's set the stage and get a better understanding of the circumstances under which Africa is celebrating this year.
Months after its declaration as a pandemic by the World Health Organization, the total number of COVID-19 cases has risen to around 330,000 globally, with confirmed cases of around 5 million across 216 countries and territories. As the world races against time in search of a vaccine, businesses across the globe are taking a hit from government lockdowns. But are these dire measures sustainable, especially in Africa? In a world where there is deficit on global leadership, how has Africa fared in the fight against COVID-19? It has been over 3 months since the COVID-19 was first confirmed in Africa. Although the continent has been spared from the high concentration of community cases seen elsewhere, the economic hardship have been felt across the region, while its fragile health systems have been weakened further. Food security is also an issue in some parts, as a locust infestation is threatening livelihoods in parts of East Africa. Although the coronavirus is a global problem, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa says Africa can use targeted trade policies to tackle the pandemic. The global movement, One Campaign, is calling for global leadership and coordination as a response to the pandemic, which the International Monetary Fund now says could leave economies struggling for years to come.
Now, as at the 24th of May, Africa has had a total of over 107,000 confirmed COVID-19 cases, with over 42,000 recoveries and over 3,000 deaths. But to explore ways to protect Africa's progress during the COVID-19 pandemic, my guests for this conversation are Dr. Vera Songwe. She is the United Nations Under-Secretary General and the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. I also have with me Dr. Nkengasong. He's the Director of the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And last but not the least, Edwin Ikhuoria, who is the Africa Executive Director of the One Campaign. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today on this special day in Africa. But I'd like to open up and get your thoughts on Africa Day and also today's theme, which is Africa's progress, protecting Africa's progress during COVID-19. I'd like to start with Dr. Vera.
Yes, please. Good morning, and thank you for having me, and happy Africa Day to all the those who are watching. I think Africa has made substantial progress. The first thing that we should say is that Africa reacted very quickly in locking down. And so what we saw was that as a way of containing the pandemic, a recent study that the Economic Commission for Africa just did shows that 42 countries went into lockdown. As we know, isolation, distancing, physical distancing are the right thing to do. There was a huge campaign which was launched, coordinated by the African leaders, the African Union, on hand washing and safe hands. I think that also took root. And of course, now when you go to many African countries, the whole sort of wearing of masks is operational. So on the health side, and Dr. John Nkengasong, good morning to you, and Edwin, good morning as well, we'll be able to complement that. But I think for Africa, we first had a huge economic hit, because what happened was a lot of our businesses, a lot of the, as you know, the tourism sector closed down, the airlines closed down, but many African countries on the economic side also came in quite quickly to provide domestic stimulus packages. In countries like Senegal, over $1 billion was put from the national budget. In Cote d'Ivoire, $1 billion to 28, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, 6.3 billion in Egypt, to respond to the crisis. So countries went into their own budgets immediately to start looking at how can they respond to this crisis. So I think, you know, in countries like Benin, you know, there were tax holidays that were given. In Egypt, you know, tax holidays, energy payment holidays, so that people could still have electricity and continue to live without suffering. So my sense is what has happened is a very coordinated approach led by the African Union, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, finance ministers, responding first to this economic hit. And then, of course, under the leadership of the CDC, and we'll hear from my brother John, the health response with the health ministers then took hold.
All right, Dr. John, let me get your thoughts as well on this team protecting Africa's progress during COVID-19, as well as your thoughts on Africa Day.
No, thank you so much, and happy Africa's Day for all of us. And it's really an honor to be part of this conversation today. And we have a series of events to mark Africa Day. And I'm just wondering what our forefathers will be saying, or foremothers will be saying today. I mean, with the challenge, the unprecedented challenge we have in our hands to get rid of COVID-19 on our continent. As Dr. Songwe said, I think our continent has done well. If this was a test, I would say that we've scored extremely well in the very initial phase of the response. Having said that, I think we know, all of us collectively, that the journey will be long, that we are still in the early phases of the response, and very importantly, that we have to make use of the time that we have, which is because of the very early reactions and measures that Dr. Songwe mentioned, that we were able to blunt the spread of this virus on the continent. We are at a critical point where we have to balance between saving lives and saving livelihoods. And the public health measures must be intensified in several ways. One is we need to increase our ability to test. Second is to be able to track those who are infected, isolate them, and make sure that they get the proper treatment. Thirdly, to continue to invest in ability to prepare and give care to those who will be infected and hospitalized. So again, I always say you don't build your health systems when you need them. You build it before you need it. But this is a unique opportunity for the continent to act as a whole, and I really applaud the leadership, the extraordinary leadership of the continent from the highest level of the continent, led by President Ramaphosa, the chair of the African Union Commission, Chairperson Musa Faki, and all the ministers of finance, ministers of health, and ministers of trade and transport that have rallied around to bring a holistic approach to respond to this unprecedented health crisis.
Definitely quite a lot to look at there. Edwin, let me bring you into this conversation as well and get your thoughts on Africa Day, what it means as well, and, you know, protecting Africa's progress during COVID-19.
Thank you, Kenneth. I think the biggest thing here for us, first of all, is that Africa Day is a day for us to celebrate our solidarity. And I think that you've seen that, you know, significantly as different parts of Africa are coming together, you know, even in the midst of a pandemic, to still celebrate the uniqueness of the African culture, of African people, African music, African dance, you know, the African identity, the spirit of Ubuntu. And I think that for me is one of the biggest connection we are making to this specific situation we find ourselves in terms of COVID-19. Because when we kept saying that none of us are safe until all of us are safe, the African spirit really showed that. You know, this AUCDC led a Africa continental strategy for the response to COVID-19. I think globally, when there was this nationalism and populist movement, individual countries are focusing on themselves. You know, individual countries are working to protect their own people as if the disease is going to be confined to boundaries. You know, the African continent was able to say, this is not going to happen only in Nigeria or only in Ghana or anywhere else, but this is going to be happening across the boundaries. And for that reason, we should have a continental strategy. And I think this is what we are celebrating today. And that's why we think that it's a major lesson for the rest of the world. And I think both of my other distinguished panelists have already highlighted the things that Africa did, which is that spirit of solidarity. You know, connecting that to Africa Day is what we really want to celebrate today.
Definitely African solidarity quite pertinent in how this continent is going to move forward. Dr. Vera, I would like to get to you and speak on, you know, your thoughts on what we've seen so far on the impact of COVID-19 on the continent as well, and how you think this is going to affect the continent's growth trajectory.
Yes, thank you. I believe that it would be naive to think that we will get out of this crisis the way we got into the crisis. Clearly, this continent is going to be very different from a health systems and health development standpoint in several dimensions. I mean, we should not forget that we are still, as we speak, struggling with endemic diseases, for example, HIV, TB, malaria, and childhood immunizations. because of this, the challenge of COVID infection, those programs have to be definitely be severely affected. So one of the strategy, the 3 pillars of our strategy includes harm, do no harm to these programs. So we really need to be sure that we continue to advocate for these programs in terms of the funding, in terms of resourcing them with human capacity so that they are not neglected. We should always remember that in West Africa, during the Ebola outbreak that killed over 11,000 people, there were so many people that died because of Ebola and not from Ebola. And this will certainly be the case with COVID-19 because of several reasons that we all are aware of. I think that is one. Second way that the continent will be affected seriously is, and I see that also an opportunity, that we need to reset the button and ask ourselves the question if this is not time for us to begin to think of a new public health order for the continent. A new public health order for the continent, which is based on those structural challenges that we've seen in our health systems. For example, we literally do not manufacture any diagnostics. That's why it took us forever to equip the continent with diagnostics. We import all the drugs. And as we speak, there are about 30 clinical trials going on the continent, but most of those trials or products are imported. We need to do better. Thirdly, the vaccines trials are taking place across the world, but there's absolutely no homemade vaccines on the continent. We need to change that in the spirit of a new public health order. And lastly, the way we train our disease responders and public health experts must change and begin to bring in a holistic approach. I'm very pleased to announce that today at 5 o'clock, we will be launching the Kofi Annan Global Public Health Leadership Program that will begin to train emerging leaders on the continent to look at health from a very, very holistic manner and bring the multi-dimensional components that are so critical in containing disease outbreaks like this one, which will still occur. I mean, we'll deal with this, but there will be other outbreaks there. I mean, if our forefathers came here today, they would say, well, when we left the continent, there was no HIV/AIDS, there was no COVID, which tells us that in future, there will be other outbreaks and we need to begin to prepare ourselves for the future by training our leaders that will behave the way Kofi Annan behaved and had the same vision that Kofi Annan had. So I'm calling on all of you to join us today at 5 o'clock in the launch of the Kofi Annan Global Health Leadership Program.
All right, Dr. Songwe, quite an interesting shock we've had with this COVID-19. I'd also like to get your thoughts on how you see this impacting Africa's growth trajectory.
Look, the whole world is shut down or has been shut down for almost 2 months. The IMF has come out with data telling us that our growth in Europe is going to go down by -6%. So we're going to have -6% growth. Globally, we're going to have -3% growth. The Economic Commission for Africa came out with data for all of Africa, which shows that we will be at best at 1% growth. Remember, we were initially growing at 3.2, so we have lost about 2 percentage points of our growth in this crisis. So that is the first shock. The second shock is we've done some work at the Economic Commission for Africa again that shows that when growth drops, and particularly when it drops even more, and let me add China is seeing a -6.8% growth. They've never seen this since the time of Mao Zedong. And actually over the week on Friday, the Minister of Finance of China came out and said they will not do any growth projections because they cannot even do projections for what growth is going to look like. So this is the first time in Chinese history where you're having the party meetings and no growth projections. So that is what we are facing. We're facing a global calamity. For Africa, when you have these kinds of contractions in growth, you immediately have increases in poverty, 40% increases in poverty. Already the depth of poverty on the continent is quite deep, which means that the poor in Africa are much poorer. They're 40% poorer than the poor in the rest of the world. So when you have an additional hit on them, it's quite important. I think we're talking today from South Africa. It's not just that the poor are going to drop into more poverty, but what we have is a vulnerability line, which has been essentially Africa's SMEs, Africa's informal sector. that group of vulnerable people, those taxi drivers, those women who work in the markets, those hairdressers, those are the ones that are going to fall into poverty immediately. And the sad thing about it is that we don't know how to identify them. So I think another thing that has to come out of this crisis is how we build stronger digital identity systems so that we can actually identify all of our populations. But more importantly, and as we come out, I think one of the things we have seen is an amazing resilience from Africa's private sector. I think Africa's private sector is what is holding us and what is going to bring the continent back. But we must ensure that as we begin to work on, Dr. Nkengasong talked about, the health PPEs, we must make sure that our private sector is concerned, is also open for business. And what are the instruments that we need to put in place? We have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. I think never before has this been more important, not just for the production of PPEs, but we see that today Africa imports quite an amount of food, of wheat, of rice, of oils, of sugars, but we can produce those on the continent. And the question is, can those things move across borders? Dr. John Nkengasong and Jack Ma's foundation have been trying to distribute PPEs and our borders are closed. Can we open them? Can we ensure that there are corridors that allow for those goods to cross borders and make sure that trade works? Because if trade works, and if trade continues to work as the CFTA wants it to, I think that Africa can begin to rebuild in a much stronger way. Because together as Africans, we can actually feed ourselves. But we need to be able to move maize from Mali to Malawi, and we need to be able to move rice from Senegal to Ethiopia. And until we can do that, I think the continent will remain weak. And my sense is with the COVID-19, we're beginning to show that the continent itself is resilient enough. We can open our borders. Our private sector is responding incredibly well to the crisis, and collectively we should do well. One group that we have not mentioned and we must mention are the civil society. Civil society in places like Kenya, in South Africa have been amazing in terms of taking care of the vulnerable, making sure that the information gets to them, they understand what they need to do, but also that their livelihoods are protected. And I think that the collective working together of the different parts of society is what is going to make Africa stronger and come out of this bigger and better. Thank you.
Definitely, Africa needs to come out of this stronger. Edwin, I'd like to take you up on this from a different angle now. We're looking at the SDGs, meeting the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And this shock is coming just a decade before the deadline of the SDGs will be in effect. And I'd like to get your thoughts from you, what more Africa needs to do, so that we don't lose the progress we've made in the years of the MDGs, building up onto the SDGs as well.
Thanks, Kenneth. And I think that for me is one of the core reasons why we're having this panel today. The idea is, how do we protect the progress we've made? From 1990, from the days of the MDGs to now where we transition to the SDGs, the whole idea is that by 2030, we should have nobody living under the poverty line or living in extreme poverty. But what we've seen so far is that, like Dr. Vera said, with this pandemic, we might be losing the progress we've made for the past 25 years. And this is the biggest challenge here. And the challenge here is that the number of deaths that we've prevented from vaccines, right? From improving access to vaccines for these kids, those child killer diseases, right? There is a risk of really reversing that progress we've made. And so that is why the attention we're calling here is that as we fight COVID-19, we cannot neglect some of those other places where we've made progress. Dr. John actually mentioned those ones: HIV, TB, and these other non-communicable diseases. So those are some areas. So as we fight COVID-19, a key agenda is that we should not lose sight of the other key indicators that we are pushing. Now, in terms of food security, and we, Dr. Vera really mentioned, this is the biggest and the number one goal is no poverty, no hunger. Now, with the current situation, with the lockdowns that happened, farmers in almost all the countries where lockdowns took place couldn't go to farms. And for that reason, they couldn't produce, or they couldn't plant us at the time. And as you know, farming or production, agriculture production is time specific. So if as we lock down and we prevent people from going to the farm at the time they are supposed to go to the farm, and the rains come and people are not planting, then that itself means that in the future, there's going to be a major crisis with food or access to food. And this will also make us, again, more reliant on external imports, for food. And this is one of the biggest insecurities that we can have. And so these are the risks that COVID-19 poses for us. But so the recommendation is that as we pursue these things, as we create palliatives or make attempts to fight this pandemic, we should remember that there are other things that are as pressing as the pandemic, and so not lose sight of them. And so in terms of other areas, health, food, but in terms of trade, for instance, one of the biggest things that the biggest achievements was when Africa came together and agreed on the CFTA. So we just thought that it was a major way to achieve the SDGs going forward, because youth unemployment is a major bane on the African continent. As you could tell, when we are saying this year was the year of silencing the guns. And the idea is that there's no way you can silence the guns when people's stomachs are hungry. People become vulnerable. They are easily, radicalized because they don't have anything else to do. And this is why we thought that this year would be a year of consolidating our industrial base and trading within African nations, so that youth can get the opportunities they have. But with this pandemic, what we are seeing is that less attention is paid to that because of the emergency. But we need to know that when we are coming up building back better, and we put this youth employment in focus, then all of those policies that we've already agreed on, like the CFTA, like the industrial roadmaps and all of that, must still be in the vision. We must still keep our eyes on them. We cannot neglect them at this point. Those are some areas we thought that as we pursue this, if we do not pursue those other agenda at the same time, we could lose the progress we've made for the past 25 years.
Quite interesting contributions you put there, Edwin. Dr. John Nkengasong, I would like to get your thoughts on testing. I would like to understand some of the challenges we're seeing and even some of the innovations that have come out of Africa in this time of COVID-19.
So let me start with the good news first. The good news is that because of the challenge that we are faced with testing, countries are beginning to innovate. And we have groups in Senegal, South Africa, Morocco, and Kenya trying to develop prototype tests. And Africa CDC is at the center of that. We are trying to facilitate a rapid evaluation and validation of those technologies so that we can bring them to the market quickly. As we speak, we've actually facilitated a multi-site evaluation of a test that has been a polymerase chain reaction test that has been produced in Morocco to be tested in Senegal, South Africa, and Ghana, and very, very rapidly, so that we can know what the performance is and then promote the scale-up production from within the continent. That will be a tremendous source of pride. We're also working with the group in Senegal to validate the test that you all have heard about, and of course, Kenya and South Africa. So that's the good news. Until the COVID-19 hit the continent, we didn't just have those innovations and groups that were devoted in developing diagnostic tests. If the continent had been hit in January, when we all came back, came out from the holiday, the end of year holiday break, we would have been completely disarmed, because there was no single country on the continent that had the ability to test for the virus. Now, the number one lesson we are learning from this, and must learn from this, is that the continent plays itself at a very, very vulnerable position by depending on trickle-down diagnostics. That is, diagnostics that are produced in the West, then imported into the continent. I remember vividly when we just, in January, we knew that and saw that this was a threat that would definitely hit Africa. At that time, only 400 cases of COVID-19 had been reported across the entire world. And it was, or less than that. And we reached out to groups in Europe that were producing some of the diagnostics. I mean, the answer was very simple, that you don't have an issue, so don't bother. Our interest is to support countries in Asia and the European market. So again, that in terms of health security of the continent, we are extremely vulnerable if we cannot produce diagnostics, if we cannot produce drugs, and if we cannot produce vaccines. So we are beginning to unlock that market as we speak. About the continent as a whole has tested about 2 million people. We hope that that number will increase steadily as we continue to work with multiple partners, including, of course, the World Health Organization. and the private sector and many other groups to provide a supply chain management of that. So what is the target we should be aiming at? In order to be comfortable, we should be able to test 1% of our population. And if we estimate that Africa is a continent of 1.2 to 1.3 billion, it means our need or target should be 12 million to 30 million tests. And that's why we launched the initiative called the Partnership to Accelerate COVID Testing, with a target of reaching 10 million to 15 million in the next 3 months, with a target of deploying 1 million community workers that will assist in the contact tracing of those who are infected and isolating them, with the target of establishing a platform on the continent that will enable us to pool procurement and for diagnostics and make sure that we have the right volumes to make us be competitive in the markets that we are sourcing for this testing there. So it has been a challenge, an uphill challenge to get to where we have to be, but I'm happy that we are making progress slowly to at least beat this up. And we have to do it quickly. As I said, it looks like we still have a very strong fighting chance to push back COVID-19 on the continent, but we have to do that with appropriate scale-up of diagnostics in a timely fashion, backed by the ability to trace their contacts, isolate them, and then start the process all over. That's the only winning formula we have in our hands now.
All right then, Dr. John, they're talking about the winning formula. I needed to hold that thought and we'll take a quick break. Definitely I've been speaking to Dr. John Nkengasong, is the director of the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Also, I've been speaking to Edwin Ikhuoria, who is the Africa Executive Director for the One Campaign, and Dr. Vera Songwe. She's the United Nations Under Secretary General and the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. Dr. Songwe, I'd like to take this up with you and start as we continue our conversation. Debt sustainability is also one issue that has been, quite big on the continent for quite a while now. We've seen quite a number of African countries, go to the international lenders, to the World Bank, to the IMF, to try and get some funding, to help deal with the shocks of the COVID-19. I'd like to hear your thoughts on, on this topic on debt sustainability and, how African countries should approach it going forward.
No, thank you very much. And thanks for asking this question because it's very important. I think two things. First of all, we must all remember that essentially debt in itself is not bad. Debt, every country, every person needs some amount of credit to grow. And so what the African continent has been doing is, because we're growing faster, we need a lot more sources of debt. We need a lot more sources of revenue that we can raise. We raise that from multilateral sources, the ones we know well, the World Bank, the IMF. But because African countries have also been performing very well, because our macroeconomic positions have been much better, our deficits have been much better, we've now had access to the market. So over half of the African countries can go to the markets and raise money on the capital markets. And this is a good thing. This means that the markets, our private sector creditors recognize that Africa's macroeconomic balances have improved and that we're doing well. Now, the question is, when we do that, what do we use the resources for? And this is where the debt conversation becomes important. If you take debt, if you go and borrow money, as we all know, but you invest it in something that does not give you a return, you cannot pay it back. And this is also an important conversation on the governance of how we manage our resources. If we put them into energy projects, as has been done in many countries across the continent where we have increased access to energy, in energy, you pay your bills. And so we have resources to pay back the debt. And I think that is the question, is when we talk about debt sustainability, we are talking about, did we invest the resources into projects that will give us a return so we can pay them back? If not, we have to go to the taxpayer. And there is a finite number of taxpayers. So if we raise more debt, we cannot pay. So I think that is the important part. Now, for the crisis, let's remember, in February, African countries were going to pay their debt service. Essentially, when you borrow money, you have to pay the interest on it and you have to pay the principal, and that's called the debt service. African countries were quietly and well prepared to do that. We had a crisis. We had a health crisis and we had an economic shutdown. most of our economies went. 51% of Africa's GDP today is in the service sector. The service sector went completely shut down. For our governments, as I said before, to ensure that the private sector could survive, they also asked many of the private sector to stop paying taxes. So there were no resources to immediately react. And that is why the question of a debt service stands still. So remember, we're not saying forgiveness, we're not saying cancellation, we're saying give us 2 years. Let's all understand collectively the impact of the crisis. And then we will come back and we will honor all our obligations. I think the G20, and we must be very grateful to the G20 for having launched the G20 Debt Sustainability Initiative. We're very happy with the IMF that has come up and gotten already 19 countries on the continent from the call of the finance ministers have gotten debt relief. So they don't have to pay for their debt. 19 countries. That allows them, and I think we do need to start making this connection, that allows them to be able to go and get the test kits that Dr. Nkengasong is talking about. We need 10 million test kits if we're going to fight this. Countries have gotten the debt relief. They have extra liquidity. They have extra resources. They should now apply it. First of all, to ensuring that we get the material for the test kits, but secondly, to ensuring that those who have lost their jobs can find food. I think, as Edwin was saying, this is the second most important part of our society. Otherwise, we get into crisis. Many countries have given themselves 10, 15, 20% stimulus packages. What Africa is asking for, the IMF has estimated the demand about $114 billion. The finance ministers asked for $100 billion of fiscal stimulus. That goes into the budgets. But we still have a private sector that needs resources. And this is where we are also calling for more support for what we call the special drawing rights. This is money that goes into foreign exchange, allows countries to be able to buy food, to be able to buy oil, to be able to buy everything that we import. Today, Africa still imports 94% of its drugs from outside the continent. Even if we had to buy those drugs, we will need foreign exchange. And that is why we need this additional piece of the special drawing rights to ensure that we have in South Africa, where you are today, the currency has dropped about 20%. That means that you need more to buy what you used to buy before. And so special drawing rights are quite important to ensure that we can cushion that conversation. 3 things have happened. We have a multilateral debt service. We've seen the IMF particularly come back and give some debt relief. The G20 has talked about a bilateral debt standstill for first 1 year and then possibly to be extended. And then there is a commercial a portion of that conversation. So we hope that across the board on these 3 segments, we will be able to provide some immediate resources to countries to respond to the health crisis first, and then secondly to the economic crisis by ensuring that the poor don't get poorer. And there is at least a minimum number of service packages that can be provided.
Definitely, quite interesting there, talking about the poor not getting poorer. Edwin, I'd like to bring you in on this and, talk about why it's important for us to have that coordinated response, for us to move the needle and end extreme poverty.
Thanks, Ken, because it's raining here in Abuja, so you probably might hear some kind of background sound. But I think the biggest part of this response that we talked about, like Vera talked about, is first, monitoring what that money is used for. So if African governments borrow this money or they get a debt standstill, and then it increases the liquidity for them to be able to invest, either in palliatives, in stimulating the economies, and all of the things that have been talked about, how do we know that this is really going to happen? Because the credibility of the African government depends on this. Because when you're asking people to give you a debt standstill, when you're asking people to give you more money to be able to do other things, then you have to be able to demonstrate that this is important. And these are the things that we are really calling. This is the reason why we are calling for a key partnership with civil society, to be able to independently monitor the things or the procurements that the governments are making, the investments that they are making. When they say they are giving palliatives, who are they giving palliatives to? How is it reaching the people? Because, for instance, there are in some countries, palliatives were given in cash in the 21st century Africa. So these are the kind of things where we're saying that how could you give people cash? When you could give people money through accounts, how do you use this opportunity to increase financial inclusion? And how do you know those who are procuring, the things that they are procuring, are they the things they should be procuring at this point? So those are the kind of monitoring mechanisms that we think that civil society as a whole should really jump on board to also enhance the credibility of African government when they go out to ask for this. The UNECA and the finance ministers are leading this call. The special envoys have been appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and they are going about around the world, both multilateral and private creditors, asking for specific, these incentives to be available, these resources to be available to African countries. But if we are not sure, if there is no trust that these resources will be available and will be utilized for the real investment that are supposed to be, then this will be a challenge. So that is one. On the other end is that as we coordinate this, we know how difficult it is, this debt conversation is, particularly individual countries. These are usually bilateral conversations. But how do we create a coordinated mechanism where Africa as a whole is negotiating collectively, either the terms of the debt or the structure of those debts? How do we also collectively agree on the transparent mechanism for these terms? So this coordination is what we are really thinking beyond just the call for these resources. It's how do we ensure that there is space for citizens to monitor the use of this, and for citizens for the trust to be built both with bilateral donors or bilateral partners and private capital, globally. So these are the things that we are calling for, to say it cannot just be the government alone, and governments cannot be acting individually. There has to be a collectively agreed norm for how this should be done. And this is one major role that the UNECA has really helped with. And we think that we can make this go further than what we have now.
All right, so quite interesting perspective you put out there, and it brings me to the point about pooling resources, and I would like to get Dr. John Nkengasong's input on this. What has been the experience, in pooling resources, trying to get, resources to fight the COVID-19 pandemic on the continent? And I also understand that you have a digital purchasing system in place, and I'd like to get more clarity on that.
So, thank you. I think I would come back to the pooling aspect there, but let me just comment a little bit on what Dr. Songwe mentioned there about. I'm learning a lot from being on some of the calls that she organizes every week with a whole spectrum of high-level economists that I'm clueless about what economists, how the formulas work there, but I'm learning a lot. And one thing that I would like to follow through with that conversation about the debt standstills and civil society is to say that this is the highest time we have a conversation with ministers of finance and economies that putting money into health systems is truly an investment. And it's an investment that the return on that investment is huge. I mean, the reason we are into this crisis is because of a virus. We should always remember that. And the reason that we need all the billions now is because our health systems are terribly challenged and broken. And the reason that we are trying to import ICU units and ventilators is that we are trying to fix our health systems while we are in need of them. So I think I would continue to be a student of Dr. Songwe in economics, so that we can make a strong case that as the countries make available those monies from debt relief and other processes there, they should really, in a very deliberate manner, allocate a good percentage of that to strengthen and overall our health system. As I said, if we get out of this crisis the way we went in, then I don't think we learn anything, at least from them, because there will be another crisis there, absolutely. We live in a world that we are bombarded with viruses and they are emerging and re-emerging. And they happen over and over. And each time they happen, the reaction is that we bring in commissions, the right good reports, and they outline exactly what needs to be done. If you take the reports from the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, you can easily substitute the Ebola with the COVID-19, and you have a report already ready to be to go around and circulate. The thing is, nothing happens after that. So we should really focus on the do nothing known gaps that have really plagued us. The analogy I use all the time is that you have a kitchen sink that is leaking, and you focus on the floor to mop the floor, to clean it with water, and you forget that the sink is still there. The water flowing in the sink is a virus that will still appear again and challenge us there. So we need to really engage the civil society, engage economists like Dr. Songwe, and bring to the fore that we need to, a good place to start this discussion once this is all over is to say, how do we very deliberately invest in our health systems and build them in a way that we can need them in future. Now, in terms of addressing the issues related to pool procurement and platform, I think perhaps that will be one of the most innovative things that will emerge from this. I mean, besides the deliberate way we should look at strengthening our health facilities and systems, the continent cannot continue to rely on individual smaller countries going out there with small amounts of quantities of reagents or protective commodities, what I'm calling commodities needed to support the response spectrum in isolation. We need to pool. When we pool, we have the right numbers. We have the right numbers. We can negotiate and have the right price in there and lock them. That price in a very totally transparent manner, which we need to do. And the Africa CDC platform that we are working on very closely with Dr. Songwe, Strive, Masiwa, and others is going to be innovative, extremely innovative adventure that I'm personally excited that in the next 2 weeks or so, that can be a game changer as we fight this COVID-19 going forward on the continent. Remembering that we will be in here for a long haul. This is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. So we have to invest in things that are required for this response appropriately, and then look at things that will outlive this response with the notion that we have to win this fight against COVID to survive, but we still have HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, immunization, so that same platform can be used in future to continue to support our struggle to control and prevent these diseases.
All right, definitely a marathon that we'll have to run. But I'd like to get to one very important part of this marathon that we're trying to achieve and ensuring that our education outcomes don't suffer in all of this. Dr. Vera, I'd like to get your input on this.
Indeed, I think that one of the things that we have seen is with this crisis, inequality is going to become deeper because those who can afford it have their kids studying at home with internet facilities like the one we're using today. But many of our rural kids, over 300 million of our kids, do not have access to the internet, do not have access to online education, which means that those kids have fallen further behind. And a demographic that we have not spoken about yet is our young girls. When the young girls are out of school, then we run into issues of early childhood marriage. And so we need to be very careful right now that we can at least protect those kids that have been going to school, and particularly the young girls, to make sure that the parents don't see them, unfortunately, as commodities that you can exchange because they have lost incomes and get them into early marriage. But that is why the internet technology, the ECA has our digital center of excellence. What we have seen is, yes, we talk a lot about the fact that Africa has cell phones, but 600 million Africans have non-analog cell phones, non-digitized cell phones. So we can't do much. You can't get on the internet with them. You can't trade with them. Only 150 million actually do have cell phones that allow you to do e-commerce and e-trade. 27% of our population, we must do better, we can do better. And I think there is a lot of work on the digital space. We have seen across the world that where we have won the fight, even on tracing and tracking and treating in the health crisis, it has been where countries have access to technology. So if ever there was a doubt about the importance of ensuring that our continent becomes technologically enabled. It's not for the fourth industrial revolution. It's for fighting health pandemics. It's for ensuring that when there is a disaster, we can find the people we need. It's for ensuring that when we have vulnerable people fall into poverty, we can actually identify them, trace them, and ensure that the safety nets that Edwin is talking about, the governance systems of those transfers work well, because it's a one-to-one transfer. We are not transferring cash. We're transferring resources onto a platform. I think we've done a lot of seminars at the African Union and the ECA across the world to see how did Italy survive, how did Spain survive, how did China survive. It was essentially because businesses moved from personal face-to-face businesses to the internet. We can't do that today. Our girls need to keep going to school, and they can't keep going to school because the education system is broken and we need to fix it. So I think as we talk about how we come out of this crisis, we need to remember two things. One, connectivity is going to become the most important space as we go forward. Even today, when we talk about what we did well with Ebola, it was because we were able to trace, track, and digitize some of those systems. So we need to remember those things, but then speed on. Our heads of states have just passed the digital strategy, working with the African Union and the ECA. So we now have the strategy. We know what to do. We know that we need to, half of our continent does not have an identity. We know that we need to put those people onto a system where they can get an identity, because how do you track, trace, and treat people if they don't even have an identity? So all these problems begin to come together. And I think that if there is one space where we need to build back better, it is in the space of ensuring that Africa is digitized. And the value add of digitization, I think, for the continent today, particularly such a young continent, is going to be amazing. And that is what is going to grow us back. And we must make sure that our policymakers focus on that.
Definitely, digitization is a key part of how we're going to tackle this and even future shocks that could come. Edwin, I would like to get your thoughts as well on the points that Dr. Vera raised, talking about ensuring that we achieve our education outcomes and that they don't suffer, as well as the inequality angle she brought in as well.
Thank you, Ken. I think there are several things I wanted to just bring here quickly in terms of the education piece. First of all, I think Dr. Vera has talked about the issue of access. The people who are most vulnerable, unfortunately, get a double whammy, because when you ask them to lock down, they are the ones who are not able to work from home. Number one, they're the ones that are not able to send their kids or give their kids online education. And so that even increases the inequality in terms of access. Now, the other part is in terms of information dissemination generally. You would see that with this COVID, the African disinformation or misinformation ecosystem was really, really terrible. So the online access for the few that got it just multiplied misinformation. And now it also gives us an opportunity to pass on the right information. Like you're probably aware, one is doing what we call the pass the mic, where we are asking talents and influencers to use their followers, to lend their followers to the right knowledge, to the right information. And so digitization, again, enables us to reach more people with the right kind of information so they can also be part of the solution. So these are other things that we are doing in that sense. We're talking about the whole point of how we connect our building back better, how the lessons we learn from here and how that can help us, leapfrog Africa. Strategy is there. There's a lot of commitment. Norms have been set. Dr. John has talked about the health system, the connection between the health system and the economy. I think we've been pushing this Abuja declaration for a long time, since 2001, to say 15% of national budget, to health. Many people, many African leaders, some have been doing that, but many have not. But in one fell swoop with the COVID-19, everybody suddenly realized that if you do not invest in health, you're basically investing in the economic failure for the future. And I think those messages are clear. And again, the biggest decider of poverty really is illness or being sick. No matter how rich you are, you're probably just one illness away from poverty. Because when you have when you are sick, nothing else matters. You're just trying to survive, and you could spend everything you've earned, to get yourself back. So the reason why we are calling for a stronger health system, because it will help reduce inequality, because it will help reduce vulnerability back to poverty. And so all of this put together, we are hoping that we can get some good lessons from here, that after COVID-19, we have a stronger health system on the African continent that will increase the resilience of the African people so that they don't easily fall back because of illness. That is on one hand. But on the other hand, any investment we've made in education, in digital transformation, in digital assets would help people be more resilient in terms of their businesses, in terms of formalizing the large informal sector. Again, I think that is a big part of what we've seen from COVID-19, that with a lot of people who earn their food daily that are not identified, that are not formal, they're not recognized, they're not even known by the government. So when they were asked to stay at home, it just escalated everything. But we are hoping that after all of this, with the right investment in digital technology and access to digital platforms, many of these informal businesses or SMEs can be transformed, to have a formal presence and formal identity that can itself help improve our resilience. So there's a whole lot that we can get out of this situation.
Yeah, a lot of opportunities in this COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, we're quite fast running out of time, but I'd like to get the final word from everybody. Just a quick 1 minute. We're starting with you, Dr. John, and then I'll go to Dr. Vera and end with Edwin.
No, thank you. It has been a pleasure to really listen to this very lively debate. And as a continent, we have to leave this conversation and the Africa Day remembering that we are at war against COVID-19. I've never seen any virus that has spread this quickly. I mean, we've lived with HIV/AIDS for 40 years, and about 75 million people have been infected in that 40 years period, which means we get about 2 million people infected every year. For less than 5 months, about 1.5 million people have been affected with this virus there. So it just tells you the seriousness of a virus that is moving that quickly. For our continent, we have to understand that we have to celebrate the battle, the victory as a continent. No one country will be able to say that they've liberated or freed themselves from COVID-19 if the surrounding countries are still experiencing COVID-19. So solidarity is key. We have to keep the African solidarity alive to be able to celebrate an African victory against COVID-19 in the very nearest future.
Dr. Vera?
No, I think as we celebrate Africa Day, we remember Africa's greats. One of Africa's greatest was Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, who was one of the world-renowned chemists. I think that the innovation that we see today from our private sector, from our youth, from our civil society, tells us that Africa can be that again. We can be great. And as Nelson Mandela said, it's impossible until it's done. Africa is doing it. So I think that we have shown that there is nothing that is impossible. In Cameroon, we say that the impossible is not Cameroonian. So we can do more and we can do better. So I'm sure that as we celebrate Africa Day, we should, one, remember fiscal distancing. The only way we will win this is that we will win it by ensuring that we keep the rules, we do the fiscal distancing, we wash our hands. I think that we're doing well today. We have to continue to do better. We cannot be complacent. Growth will come back, but we want growth to come back with people and lives that have been saved. And so my sense is that as countries and our leaders struggle between how to ensure livelihoods and ensure that we save lives, the populations must come together. And so Africa Day is not about our leaders or about our civil society. It's really about, as Dr. Nkengasong said, all of us working together to bring that innovation to bear, to ensure that we can support our communities, those that are left behind, but those that are also making decisions to ensure that in a month's time, hopefully, we have won the COVID virus and we're beginning to think about building back better in a sustainable and inclusive way. Thank you.
All right, then thank you so much. And Edwin, your final thoughts?
I think those are the same thoughts I wanted to express. Basically, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. No one country can say they have won the virus unless every other country, globally actually, has won the battle. And so we must call for that global solidarity, and then an African solidarity particularly, should be an example for the rest of the world. And I think also I would just like to say that as Africans, we should listen to the experts. We should listen to the people who have the right information. There's so much disinformation going out there that it is time for us to think about who is saying the right things. And these are the platforms that we are bringing out, asking the experts to talk about the issues. And finally, is that there is no economy without health. And so building our health systems, investing in our health systems, strengthening our health systems is one sure way of, one, bringing down inequality and also giving us a resilient economic system in the future. And we as civil society will continue to track and pursue the government as they get this resource, ask for resources as they spend them, so that the African citizen is at the center of all development plans. And we just want to thank you all for, for being part of this panel. And we're hoping that as many as we can that are listening to us, we can all build back better when we defeat this disease. Thank you very much.
All right, then Edwin says no economy without health. And thank you so much, Mike, for my guests who have been with me today. So very interesting input you've put forward today. Definitely a lot to thought-provoking, insightful, and quite a lot to look out to. I've been speaking to Dr. Vera Songwe, the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. Dr. John Nkengasong is the Director of the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And last but not the least, Edwin Ikhuoria, the Africa Executive Director for the One Campaign. And that's it on today's special on Africa Day. Africa has come quite a long way and there's still a lot to go, but definitely we'll forge on and be more resilient. I'll leave you with a cross-section of Africans as they tell us what Africa Day means to them. Thank you so much for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.
Africa Day is the day where all Africans across the world need to celebrate how far we have come as a continent.
To me, Africa Day symbolizes an Africa that is united, an Africa that is peaceful, an Africa that is prosperous.
Africa Day to me means a time of reflection where we Africans need to celebrate our continent and its resilience despite the challenges we faced and are currently facing.
The Africa Day is a statement that whatever misery we are going through, if our continent is united, we will definitely see the light.
To me, Africa Day serves as a timely reminder of our shared heritage and values, of the beauty in our diversity and the enormous strength that lies in our unity.
We have the raw materials, the human resources, and we most importantly have the heart. We need to join hands and work together in order to make life better in Africa.
Now, more than ever, especially in the middle of this pandemic, we need to talk about the necessity and importance of good governance. African nations need to prioritize what's really important, things such as investment in healthcare, agriculture, and good leadership. We need to ask ourselves if in 10 to 15 years from now, we want to remain where we are or we want to move ahead together.
The young people of this continent have proved that they are capable of leading Africa toward change. I see this as an opportunity to tap into the potential of young people so that they lead Africa toward a more prosperous and peaceful continent.
It is amazing how some African countries have been able to manage the COVID-19 pandemic.
Only by acting and joining hands and supporting one another can we win the war against the COVID-19 pandemic.
Despite all the sadness, this is a celebration we cannot miss. This is a day of hope. This is a day we have to hold our heads high.
Africa Day to me is a day of accountability and a day of celebration. Happy Africa Day to all Africans across the world.